Good evening, and thank you for joining us for this special Faith Nation on China's threat to America and the world. From the CBN studio here in Washington, D.C., I'm John Jessup. Well, threatening, entrapping, and even kidnapping at the hands of a vast network of alleged spies targeting critics of the Chinese government. And as Dale Hurd reports, it's happening right here in the U.S.
This is the first former member of China's secret police to speak publicly about Beijing's active campaign to silence Chinese pro-democracy voices overseas. Calling himself Eric, he was an agent for China's Ministry of Public Security, or First Bureau, from 2008 until last year, when he defected to Australia.
My job was to collect the intelligence about the country I was in and the anti-communist groups there. I was supposed to infiltrate these groups, make friends, and trap targets for return to China.
Eric was coerced into becoming an agent in 2008 after his arrest for supporting a pro-democracy party and given a choice: help the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, catch dissidents abroad or go to jail. He chose the former, taking on fake identities such as a property executive and an anti-communist freedom fighter to lure dissidents to countries where they could be abducted and returned to China. But because he secretly protected targets and says no one was arrested because of his work, he was concerned his handlers would become suspicious, and he decided to defect.
I didn't want to be responsible for any targets being returned to China. And I tried to make sure that it did not happen. And this made my bosses suspicious of me.
Eric's testimony confirms our reporting and the reports of others that a Chinese government spy network is threatening, entrapping, and even kidnapping critics of the Chinese Communist government.
These are kind of the methods being used by the CCP. Again, this is not an allegation we're making. This is what their official documents state.
Laura Harth, who tracks Chinese transnational repression for the human rights group Safeguard Defenders, says we can assume there are agents like Eric operating in the U.S. But these CCP agents are only part of a larger campaign by the Chinese government called the United Front.
So the United Front is something that's being defined by the Chinese Communist Party as one of its secret or magic weapons. And essentially its task is two things. On the one hand, expand the so-called circle of friends of the Chinese Communist Party. So co-opting or influencing politicians, media, academia, entrepreneurs. But on the other hand, and this is something that is often overlooked when we talk about United Front, its task is also to crack down on critics, right? To silence them, to divide them.
An Amnesty International survey of Chinese students in 24 universities in Europe and North America found that many live in fear of surveillance, harassment, or intimidation by Chinese agents. It's unclear how many of the so-called Chinese police stations used to control dissidents are still operating in the U.S. On paper, it might be less than 5. The one above a noodle shop in New York we showed you last year was finally shut down by authorities.
Police stations, or so-called police stations, is really the tip of the iceberg. We need to take a broad view and understand what the wider picture looks like and the amount of proxies and networks that the Chinese Party state is operating.
Bob Fu, the founder and president of the Texas-based ministry China Aid, helped lead the 1989 Tiananmen Square protest as a student. He still faces harassment by Chinese agents 35 years later.
Recent few months, even, I had been harassed and receiving threats with text messages, and also CCP agents booked hotels under my name and then called the police from New York to Los Angeles, from Washington, D.C. to Houston, basically for bomb threats. Said Bob Fu was about to set off bombs.
Pro-democracy activist Li Jianji in Los Angeles, who Chinese agents have tried to kill 3 times, told us Chinese Americans are still surrounded by constant threat of danger. In a special message to his former colleagues still trying to harass and trap Chinese dissidents, Eric encouraged them to recognize the nature of the Communist Party, that it's a fascist, totalitarian party, and that carrying out these illegal and secret activities in various countries is not good for them. And he challenges them to instead do something good for human civilization. Beijing's continued repression of overseas Chinese begs the question, if those Chinese who fled communism for freedom still live in fear of the Chinese Communist Party, are they really free? Dale Hurd, CBN News.
Vast stretches of Oklahoma farmland traded for fast cash, and not to grow corn or wheat. When we come back, see China's designs for America's breadbasket. Well, ever since the Sooner State legalized medical marijuana, investors have been making the trek from mainland China. Chinese backers have bought nearly 2 million acres of Oklahoma farmland. CBN's Tara Merchner reports on the fallout.
Mexican cartels have long dominated the black market marijuana trade in the U.S., but the Chinese have also emerged as significant players, including here in Oklahoma after the state legalized medical marijuana several years ago. Once celebrated for picturesque landscapes, the Oklahoma fields of green that sustained generations of farmers with income.
My mom and dad raised all of us here.
And Americans with food are now a hot real estate commodity, generating international interest.
Welcome to your own piece of paradise. 160 acres of land for sale in northeastern Oklahoma.
Foreign investors, 80% of them Chinese,
they're literally bringing in briefcases full of cash.
Planting roots in the heartland to grow marijuana.
Smells like a dead skunk.
Oklahoma's land rush took off when voters green-lighted medical marijuana in 2018.
Voters approved a medical marijuana proposal on Tuesday, and it's one of the most permissive in the country.
It accelerated 2 years later due to pandemic shutdowns. While other states locked down, Oklahoma opened wide for business. A medical marijuana grower license allows a business to legally grow marijuana for medicinal purposes in Oklahoma, but the number of black market operations is on the rise.
People needed work, and the criminal organizations needed to be able to move their product.
The allure of affordable land, inexpensive licenses, and lax laws combined for an irresistible recipe, turning the breadbasket of America into a pot lover's paradise.
I'm getting letters. They want to buy 54 acres of my land over in Lincoln County. They gave me a price, everything. I won't sell it to them.
While Kingfisher County farmer John Emmerich turns away offers, plenty of others are trading masses of land for fast cash, quickly approaching 2 million acres across the state.
Going after the greed, the money. That's all they're doing.
Drug laws are so lax that they can pretty much do whatever they want.
Since Oklahoma prohibits land sales to non-U.S. citizens,
It wasn't the Chinese bought it. It was some white people, USA people, who did it.
criminals are paying locals or lawyers to buy it for them.
We'll pay you X amount of dollars, you put your name on the grow license, and we're going to grow underneath you.
About half of the state's 6,400 operators are currently under investigation.
Each time we've hit one of those farms, it's really a smaller part of a much bigger investigation, because that farm is oftentimes tied to 40 to 400 other farms in Oklahoma, which are all being run by a higher up group of people that are moving the plants, moving the workers, and more importantly, making the money disappear.
A 2-year license moratorium is in effect as law enforcement struggles to weed out illicit pot growers.
When you've got several thousand grows across the state and you have a team of 6 to 10 people trying to keep up with it, there's just not enough time in the day or in the year for them to do it.
Their investigations widening to include human traffickers and violent crime. This was ruthless execution-style killings.
Correct. Are there other people inside?
Yeah.
Okay.
One of the worst cases happening on this 10-acre marijuana farm in Kingfisher County. What led to the execution of 4 Chinese nationals here?
So what we were told about was this was all over money, approximately $300,000. Don't care who they hurt or kill or anything.
Despite problems caused by this medical marijuana boom, supporters insist the cannabis industry is breathing new life into the state.
It's very beneficial, you know.
with it boosting our economy.
Still, while shops on almost every corner buzz with business,
gummy bears, you got vape cartridges, we have pre-roll.
Legal retailers like Brandon Carcho say the shadowy underworld is undercutting business.
They don't have to follow the regulations we have to follow, and they don't have to pay the taxes that we have to pay. It hurts us. It's definitely a risk to buy anything that's illegal. You don't know what you're getting. You don't know what's going to happen.
5 years into Oklahoma's medical marijuana program, there is growing skepticism about its legitimacy. The state has more cardholders than any other in the country.
The doctor does his appointments virtually, so you don't even have to go anywhere.
Oklahoma law outlines no qualifying conditions for obtaining a card, raising concerns about potential misuse and addiction.
Has Oklahoma, in your opinion, created more drug addicts?
Oh, absolutely. And because of the purity of the marijuana, we're seeing the adverse effects in medical and mental health.
In what many believe is a change of heart, Sooner State voters voted down a plan to also make recreational use legal, even though it would have brought in millions more in tax revenue. Still, it's clear the Wild West of weed is far from being tamed, while the marijuana industry blooms bigger, and Oklahoma farmland quickly disappears.
Is there any turning back for the state at this point?
It's the almighty dollar. We're starting to lose our morals and our values in the efforts of trying to get more money.
About 400,000 Oklahomans participate in the medical marijuana program. That's nearly 10% of the population and the largest number per capita in the country. In Oklahoma City, I'm Tara Mergener, CBN News.
See how the Chinese Communist Party is trying to corner the market on the global food supply when Faith Nation returns. Welcome back. China's long-term investment in African nations is turning the continent into a breadbasket to feed the Chinese. And as CBN's Gary Lane reports, that could result in shortages for the rest of the world.
This new war is happening right now without armies or any shots being fired. It's a global struggle with deadly consequences. Who will dominate the world food supply?
Food is power. We need to remember that, and this is very dangerous for the United States.
Our country's former UN ambassador for food and agriculture, Kip Tom, contends Africa is the new battleground in a conflict over global food dominance.
China wants to seize control of the continent of Africa. And it's not about the mining and the critical minerals. It's about agricultural productivity.
Gatestone Institute China analyst Gordon Chang agrees.
China has a food problem. It's worsening food shortages. Self-sufficiency percentages for food for China are relentlessly falling.
That's why this year ports in Shanghai are reportedly on target to receive 250,000 tons of food from Africa, valued at more than $500 million. The African Union wants to expand trade with Beijing and gain Chinese innovation to help expand long-term food production. Current agricultural technology has helped South Africa and Nigeria become the continent's largest food producers. Ambassador Tom suggests that led to an August visit by Chinese diplomats with Nigerian officials, followed by President Xi Jinping's trip to South Africa for the BRICS conference.
The reality is the Chinese Communist Party goes in through every country in Africa, investing in infrastructure and other projects and actually capturing the country's natural resources. But their ultimate goal is to have Africa be the breadbasket for the country of China to feed their 1.4 billion people.
And, we shouldn't have to worry just about Africa. We should be worrying about the U.S.
A future conflict over Taiwan or tariffs and trade battles could place the U.S. food supply at risk. Threatened regimes often use food as a weapon against their opponents. During the 1990s, the people of South Sudan refused to embrace Islam, and the Khartoum government retaliated by denying them food, causing many to die from starvation. Chang warns Americans should have learned from the COVID pandemic about food scarcity. While U.S. consumers couldn't get meat at grocery stores, the world's top pork producer, Chinese-owned Smithfield Foods, shipped pork to China. Although Smithfield is not a state-owned company, Chang believes it operated at the behest of the Chinese Communist Party.
It had to do what the party wanted. It shipped pork to China. at the great detriment to the United States. So we got a problem at home.
China is also taking steps to lessen its reliance on U.S.-grown food. It's turned to Brazil, making it the top exporter of agricultural products to China, providing 20% of the country's food supply. So what can be done in the short term to strengthen the food security of the United States? Ambassador Tom insists the country needs to increase domestic food production and manufacture its own critical agricultural products, like fertilizers and others, rather than getting from adversaries like Russia, Belarus, and China.
This is a wake-up call, and we could be a food power, and we could use it in a manner that benefits the United States, but our friends and allies around the world.
Chang contends China is motivated by the doctrine of Tianxia, the belief the CCP has the right to rule all under heaven, and an obligation to do so.
China's tried to dominate food because it wants to rule the world. And so we've got to understand the context of what is occurring and the significance of what is occurring. And we Americans have not been good at doing that. We just ignore what our enemies say. We ignored Osama bin Laden until 9/11. We're ignoring the Chinese now.
Gary Lane, CBN News.
Fishermen under fire. The aggressive tactics China's maritime militia is using to dominate waterways near its own land. After this. Domination of the South China Sea. It's a major goal of Beijing. Now, fishermen whose livelihoods depend on the waterway are caught in the crosshairs. CBN's George Thomas brings us the story of their struggles firsthand from Manila.
Spend any amount of time with JC Cabanillas on the water, and you'll soon discover what puts a smile on his face.
I feel the happiest when I'm at sea. This is the kind of job where you don't have a boss. It's based on your decision whether you'll go to sea or not.
3 generations of Cabanillas' family have fished these waters here off the Philippine coast. That livelihood now faces an increasing threat from China.
Every time Filipino fishermen go to the West Philippine Sea, they will be greeted by Chinese Coast Guard and Chinese fishermen. No matter how far they are, they will be reminded that you have entered Chinese territory, so you have to leave.
Fernando Haicap runs the nation's largest fishing federation, some 80,000 members. He says that China's claim to South China Sea, including the West Philippine Sea, puts fishermen like Cabanillas on the front lines of a possible military confrontation with Beijing.
Before the occupation of the Chinese government in the West Philippine Sea and larger South China Sea, area used to be a fishing ground for all fishermen from different countries: Malaysians, Indonesians, Vietnamese, Taiwanese, and Chinese. During that time, there were no stories of fights or rivalry between the fishermen. But now, the Chinese presence is so destructive.
The Philippine government warned world leaders at the recent Munich Security Conference that China's harassment of Filipino fishermen and the country's Coast Guard is now a daily occurrence.
It's clear to us what China wants. They want to occupy the West Philippine Sea and the whole South China Sea.
A Chinese Coast Guard ship hit a Philippine Coast Guard vessel last month with a military-grade laser, temporarily blinding some of the crew aboard the Philippine vessel. Several Filipino fishermen were also targeted and forced to move away from the area. The Philippine government lodged more than 200 protests against Chinese intimidation and harassment in 2022 alone.
JC here has been fishing these waters off the coast of the Philippines for more than 35 years. And today, so many of his colleagues who fish these same waters are urging the Filipino government to do more to challenge the Chinese.
To avoid direct military confrontation and still maintain a high level of intimidation, the Chinese government has deployed a maritime militia, mostly made up of commercial Chinese fishermen, to prowl these waters.
They are trained by the PLA Navy, and their wages are funded by the PLA Navy.
Retired Navy Captain Carl Schuster, a former director of operations at the U.S. Pacific Command's Joint Intelligence Center, says the militia has hundreds of commercial boats and thousands of crew members at their disposal.
The advantage of using the maritime militia is ostensibly they are commercial craft. If you check the ownership papers, they go back to a commercial entity somewhere, and that gives the Chinese government plausible deniability.
In 2021, more than 200 Chinese fishing boats converged on the Whitsun Reef, an area under Philippine control in the South China Sea.
Their basic tactics is to intimidate local fishermen into leaving the area so that China gains control of the waters by default.
The militia, dubbed as China's Little Blue Men because of the blue-painted color of their vessels, are trained to carry out offensive maneuvers, especially around disputed territories.
It's called gray zone operations. They stop short of committing an act of war, but they will use their water cannon on local fishing boats. They'll bump them, ram them, sink them, and then leave them.
Experts say China's hybrid warfare here is similar to how Moscow deployed its Russian Little Green Men to infiltrate and take over Crimea in 2014.
And in theory, they could do even more than that. If they ever wanted to launch an attack, they could even use some fishing boats clandestinely or surreptitiously to carry weapons or carry soldiers.
It's one big reason why the Philippines and neighboring countries are reluctant to openly challenge the Chinese on the high seas.
When they come up on one of these craft violating local rules, are they approaching a purely commercial craft or are they approaching an armed ship? Nations, particularly in Southeast Asia, where China is much more powerful than they are, they're very wary of interfering with any Chinese commercial fishing activity for fear of what they might actually be encountering.
Back on his boat, J.C. Cabanillas is thrilled that the United States and the Philippines are strengthening their military ties. Both countries are set to resume joint patrols of the South China Sea.
We Filipinos need to stay strong as well, so that the Chinese will see we're not scared of them. The more we look intimidated, the more they want to occupy us.
George Thomas, CBN News, Manila.
Thank you, George. And that's going to do it for this edition of Faith Nation. Have a great night.